Hey guys, good afternoon. I'm gonna do a little intro video here on budgeting and some of the basic concepts there, and we'll jump into it. So, budgeting is, I think it's one of the most important aspects of being successful in cattle production. Working in the business in terms of managing nutrition and health and the things that we've talked about is very important, and you got to get that stuff right to be successful. But working on the business and understanding costs and returns and where your income is coming from and how you can manage that is at least as critical as those technical factors to being successful in the to actually making a profit. So a budget, if you're not familiar with this, hadn't taken much any ag econ classes or anything like that. A budget is just an estimate of your income and expenditures for a set period of time. And so you can have a personal budget of your personal finances. Businesses have a budget. You can have a budget for your stock or cattle enterprise or feedlot cattle enterprise or anything like that. So it's just kind of a plan. It's an estimate of income and expenses. Okay, and it's really useful for planning the management that you're going to implement. So going through and thinking about and trying to estimate your income for a budget is going to have you think about where your income is going to come from, and it's going to make you think what are the specifics about the income that you're expecting to receive. How many cattle are you going to have? How many are you going to sell? How many are going to die, for instance? What are they going to gain? All those kind of things. It makes you think about that. And it does the same thing on the expense side. If you're trying to estimate the expense for feed, it makes you think, okay, what feed are you going to feed, and how much is it going to cost, and how much are you going to feed of it, and how long are you going to feed it, and all of those kind of things. So it's really useful for planning out your management and making you think about all the details. And then secondarily, it's really useful for evaluating the success of your management program. So if you have an estimate of what you think your management is going to produce in terms of income and expenses, and then you can actually go do that in the real world, then you can take your real results and compare them to what your plan was, and you can determine if your management plan was a success at achieving your objectives. If they match up, then great, you did a great job planning and implementing your plan. And if they don't match, then you need to understand why, so that the next time you can make them match, right? So it may be that in some cases you make a profit. If you don't have a budget, it may be that you make a profit, and you won't be able to tell if you made the profit because you had good management, or you just got lucky, or potentially you made a profit but you didn't make as much as you could have or should have made. And so you can't really tell that that's a success unless you have something to compare it to, right? Conversely, you could lose money, but if you have a plan to compare that to, and you figure out, okay, I lost money in this operation or this enterprise, but I actually beat what my plan was. I was better than the plan. Well, that's technically a success. That you could think about it that way. So having that benchmark to compare to is really important. So we kind of hit this, but a budget kind of has three pieces that you need to pay attention to. One is revenue, which is the income part. The second part is the expenses category, which is self-explanatory, and then net is the difference between revenue and expenses. Okay, so we'll kind of talk a little bit more about each of those. So revenue, this may be a new term for some of you, but revenue is the money that you receive for what you sell. Okay, it's also called gross revenue. You'll hear it talked about that in many budgets as gross revenue. If you're making a feedlot budget, evaluating a feedlot enterprise, your gross revenue comes from finished cattle. So that's what you're selling. Okay, potentially it's carcasses if you're going to sell carcasses that way, but that's where it's coming from, is what you sell. Okay. In stocker cattle budgets, gross revenue is coming from the feeder cattle that you sell when you're at the end of your stocker production phase. Just as a reference for you to think about, in a cow-calf budget, revenue would come from calves that you sell, but realize it would also come from cull cows and bulls and those kind of things that are part of that production enterprise that you sell. When you get money for those, that all goes into revenue. Okay, so we'll talk about this one at the end of class a little more, but if you have a custom grazing enterprise, which if you're not familiar with that, custom grazing is essentially something or an enterprise where you own the grass, you own the land, and you don't own the cattle. You have a customer that supplies you with cattle, and you graze their cattle on your land, and basically charge them so much per month or so much per pound of weight gain or some rate, where you're essentially selling your grass to the cattle owner who's your customer. So that's kind of what a custom grazing enterprise is. And if you're building a custom grazing budget, then your revenue comes from the gain of the cattle, which is what you're selling to the cattle owner. You're pricing your grass in terms of how much weight the cattle gain. So, the gross revenue can come from different places depending on what kind of budget it is that you're talking about and what you're developing. So we'll do an example or two, and hopefully that'll be even more clear. Okay. So the next part is expenses. Okay, and so expenses are the money that you spend to buy things. Okay, so this is probably easier for you to get your head wrapped around. And so I usually ask when we're in class, I'll ask for the students to give me examples of categories of expenses. Okay, and so in cattle budgets. So go ahead and think about those for a minute and see if you can think of different kinds of expenses for cattle budgets. Okay. And so as you're thinking through that, you probably thought of many examples. And when we do it in class, we'll usually come up with 15 or 20 different examples. But it's often things like feed, health, vaccines, antibiotics, rent, utilities, insurance, taxes, all of those kind of things. And so those are all examples of expenses. One thing that is the biggest expense to consider in stocker and feedlot cattle budgets, the big expense is the cattle that you buy. If you're buying cattle, if you're owning cattle, in most budgets we are, but if you're buying cattle, then that's going to be your biggest expense. If you're in a stocker budget, you're buying calves or stocker calves, and then you'll sell those as feeder cattle, but the cattle themselves are your biggest expense. And if you're in a feedlot budget, buying the feeder cattle that are going in the feed yard, that's going to be your biggest expense. So cattle would be the biggest expense, and then feed would be the next biggest expense. And certainly in a feed yard budget, feed would be the next one, and even in a stocker budget, if you lump in the cost of the grass, of the grazing, and call that feed, then it's the biggest expense too. And essentially that's what it is the grazing, the cost of the grass is feed for the cattle. So that's essentially what that is. So those are examples of expenses, but there's numerous categories of expenses to think about and account for. Even labor is an expense. Your own labor, certainly hired labor. So Okay, so the last one that we talked about there, this is kind of the simplest one. It's called net or net revenue, which is which is revenue minus expenses. So it's basically income minus expenses. It's also called net return, net income, net operating income, profit. There's lots of those terms that get used for this figure. Okay, and so in cattle budgets, it's going to be the top section of the budget that details the revenue minus the bottom section that details all the expenses. Okay, and so we hope in cattle budgets that number is positive, that the revenues are greater than the expenses, but obviously not. That doesn't happen in every case. Okay, so so that's net. We'll look at a budget here in a minute. What I've kind of been talking about so far are technically, you might think of as enterprise budgets. Okay, and in an enterprise budget, what you're trying to do is build a budget for a specific enterprise and not trying to budget like your entire operation. So if you're building a stocker cattle budget for the stocker cattle that you're going to have in the summer of 2023, well, that's the enterprise that you're building a budget for. And so you're to do that enterprise budget, you're just considering the income and the expenses that are associated with that specific enterprise. It may be that you also are farming summer crops and that you have a cow-calf operation also on your farm, but for this case, we would not be considering those enterprises. We're going to leave those out and just consider the income and expenses associated with running the stocker cattle in the summer of 23. And so that would be the enterprise budget. And these enterprise budgets are extremely useful because it kind of goes back to why budgets in general are useful. They help you plan your management and they help you evaluate success, but they let you do those on one enterprise at a time. And so, if you had those other enterprises that I was talking about, and you lumped them all together, things would be it would be very confusing to understand where the income and expenses are coming from, and what management's applying to the different enterprises. But it would also be hard to evaluate your success with managing your stocker cattle if the income and expenses from your cow-calf operation and your crop farming operation are all mixed in there with those numbers. I think you could see that. So these enterprise budgets are the most useful way to go about evaluating budgets for stocker and feedlot cattle enterprises. So here's an example of a spreadsheet budget. This one was put out by Oklahoma State Extension. And so this is for stocker cattle. And so what you can see here is that it kind of gives you some details and stuff here. And then this section right here would be the revenue part that we talked about. So this is the production. And basically what we're selling, it's labeled them stockers, but really I would call these feeder cattle. So I would change the label on this to feeders, but it's telling you the weight. So this is estimating how much you're going to sell, and the price, the price of those cattle at 850 pounds. It's telling you how many cattle you're going to sell. It's basically saying you're going to sell 0.94 head of feeder cattle. This is kind of calculated on a per head basis. So what that's telling you is that this has got a 6% death loss built in to this budget. So your estimate is that you're going to sell 94% of the cattle that you buy. And so that, again, coming up with these numbers is an example of how it helps you think through what your management's going to be. And so then it calculates the total revenue per head. And if you said here that you're going to have 75 head of them, well, it calculates the total. And so this one, it's about $81,000 roughly is the revenue side of this budget. Okay, and then I don't have this where we can scroll all the way through it, but this is linked here in your notes, and you'll be able to download something like this and look through it as well. But this has got the operating inputs that you can see here. So this is the stocker cattle that you buy, and you're saying we're gonna buy 500-pound stocker cattle, and this is what we paid, and so $63,000. We have a $63,000 expense for buying the cattle. So you can see that that's a major chunk of the expenses. Here's the pasture cost. It's going to be $114 a head. I'm not exactly sure how they came up with that figure, but it looks like, if you look right here in the notes, it looks like they're paying 38 cents per pound of gain for pasture cost. So I guess that would tell you how they arrived at that 114. I bet if you take 850 pounds times 0.94 minus 500 and then multiply that by 38 cents per pound, it's going to be $114. So that kind of shows you the expense there for pasture. So that's about total for these cattle. That's about $8,500. So hay is only like $600. It would probably be more than that this year if we were redoing it. And then you could go through and see all the different categories of expenses. If we were able to scroll down here, it would list things like repairs and maintenance and taxes and utilities and all that kind of thing. And then you would get to the end of that section, and it would total up those expenses for you as well. So, like I said, this is linked where you can go explore one of these. But this is a really nice way to implement an enterprise budget and help you go through that planning process. So I've got lots of links here for you, and that's kind of what we'll go through now. So these are basically tools that are going to help you implement this budget. These will help you if you can incorporate these into your class project. This is a great way to do it. But you'll want to save these links when you graduate and get out in the world, because these things are going to be useful to you for the rest of the time you're in the business. So here's an example of those budgets that we just looked at. I think we can go here and look at some beef extension calculators. Well, I don't know why that's taking a minute to load. We'll check that. So those are some examples. I'll make sure your notes have a good link in them if the link's the problem. So another thing to realize, and we just talked about this earlier, that profit is kind of that net income that we talked about. It's the amount of money that you have left over when you're done with the enterprise, and you have to realize that it might be negative. We don't like for it to be negative. We try to avoid that, but in lots of cases it can be negative. And essentially, if the profit number is negative, that essentially means that you're paying for the privilege of producing cattle. Okay. If you do a budget and you find that profit is negative, that is an extremely valuable thing to know when you're in the planning and budgeting process, because what that's telling you is that your plan for what you're going to do for your management is not, it doesn't have a good chance of making money. You're relying on luck or an improvement in the market that you can't control to make a profit, and that's not a place you want to be. And so what that's telling you, if you have a negative profit, is basically don't do what you've planned. Find a way to change the plan so that you have a good chance of expecting a reasonable profit. Okay, so if you can't make money on paper, then you shouldn't try to make money. You shouldn't try to expect to make money in the real world. Okay. Another term that we haven't talked about today, but you probably have heard it in class, is the term break even. Okay, and typically what we're talking about when you hear people talk about break even, they're talking about a break even selling price. Okay, and a break even selling price is the price that you have to sell your cattle for so that profit is zero. And you may need to think about that a minute and kind of do a couple of examples to kind of lock that in your head what that's talking about. But essentially, a break even selling price, you could think of it as like the goal of what you need to sell the cattle for, what price you need to get for the cattle, so that your profit is zero. You realize that you don't control the market price; that's out of your control. And so you have to, when you get ready to sell your cattle, you have to take the price that's offered to you by the market. And so understanding what your break-even selling price is helpful because it tells you what you have to expect, what the market has to be what the price has to be when you sell your cattle so that you get all your expenses back. Okay, it doesn't leave you any room for a profit, but if the market will be at the level of your break-even selling price, then you at least won't lose any money. Okay, so that's an important number to have in your head, and you hear people talk about that a lot in the industry. And what you have to realize is the break-even selling price is different for every producer, for every set of cattle, for every scenario, because your break-even selling price it's calculated from the cattle that you're producing and the cost structure that you have in your cattle and your management. So it's if you're comparing yours to someone else's, realize that they'll be different because their cost structure is different. Okay. Okay, so kind of move into talking about prices and markets, and realize this again. This is not the market price is not something that you really influence. You take what the market is, but prices are really important. So you need to have an estimate of price to put in and a realistic estimate of prices to put in your budgets to understand if your management's going to work or not. So the question we get a lot is, where do you find prices? Well, you can it depends whether you're asking about historical prices or current prices or future prices. Okay, and so these are all different. These are three different kinds of prices. Historical prices obviously would give you an idea of trends over time and what you could expect in the future. But and historical prices are known, right? We know what they were. So there's no question mark associated with these because we know what they are. Current price is important to know. Current price gives you an estimate of what prices will be in the immediate future, and we can easily look at and understand what current prices are by looking at a market report. So those are happening right now. So that's fairly easy to get our hands around. And then future prices, prices in the future, those would be the most useful to you in terms of budgeting, but they also have the most variability and the most question about them because obviously they haven't happened yet. And so we're making predictions about what these prices will be. And as I think Yogi Berra said, that predictions are really, really hard, especially about the future. Right? So that realize that future prices, when you're looking for sources of future prices, you're asking people what their opinions are about what's going to happen in the future, and there's a lot of variability around that. So let's look at a little bit of those historical prices and current prices. Probably one of your best sources is the USDA Ag Marketing Service, and you can look at this website here. And there are a ton of resources here in terms of getting into historical data and reports. So you could get every commodity, but here's cattle. You could click in cattle and look at a myriad of historical and even current prices. Okay, So that's going to be probably your best source for historical and current prices. Some other ones are going to be feedstuffs. I'm sorry, the report for feedstuffs is also linked here. This one will be a useful one for you to understand what feed ingredients cost, and so you can kind of get a current estimate right there on what feedstuff, things like corn, soybean meal, hay, those kind of things. The daily livestock summary is a nice report. If you click on that, you'll get a PDF, and this gets updated every day, and it gives you a nice summary of cattle prices for like the kind of the national average. Okay, so here's here's cutout prices up here. Here's numbers, the volume of slaughter cattle. Here's the 5 area weekly accumulated weighted average cattle price. So right now, the 5 areas, 5 states. I think it's Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Iowa. I think are the areas that get put into this report. But it's a good representation of the market. So this tells you like live steers. They averaged 1,448 pounds this week and sold for 180.35 yesterday. So that is a really good up-to-date price on fat cattle. So here's the Oklahoma cattle summary, and this is a great summary for lighter weights of cattle. And so this is very similar to what you looked at the beginning of class when you bought your project cattle. And so that gets updated every week, and it gives you a really good summary of what those cattle, what the prices are for different kinds of cattle. So that's a good one. And then you can do, custom reports here from this USDA side. If you want to pick a certain period of time and a certain class of cattle in a certain geographical area, you could filter data for all those kind of things and get kind of a custom report from the USDA database. So those are out there. Okay. So here's some prices about some other things. Here's pasture rental rates. This is Oklahoma and this is Kansas. Links to surveys from producers that talk about what typical pasture rental rates are. That's useful information. Here's one that's custom farming rates, a similar publication from OSU on custom farming. And so that's again in your notes. These are all linked, so you don't have to copy that down. But that's a link to custom farming rates, like for custom hay baling and plowing and seeding and all that kind of thing. But in that publication, if you go down far enough, it also includes things about cattle labor, like working cattle through a squeeze chute, feeding cattle. Those kind of things are also included in that publication. So those are useful to you. And then you can also find prices if the things that we've just looked at are all free, but you can pay for services that accumulate data and present it to you in different ways. So like here's CME, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. You can pay for some of their products. They have a few free products, but if you want to be a member, pay a subscription fee, you can get some more detailed products. CattleFax is another one that's very popular in the industry. They have a few, that chart is encouraging if you were owning cattle, right? But this shows some of the CattleFax free data, and then you can also log in as a member and get even more detailed and other kinds of data. So that's available to you, or could be available to you if you wanted to pay for it. And then LMIC is Livestock Marketing Information Center, and they kind of have a similar structure with a few free products, and then if you want to pay as a member, you can get some more additional data. Okay, and then here I think is the last one for talking about future prices and price projections, and these are the hardest to come by again, like we talked about. But this FAPRI is comes out of the University of Missouri, and it's a nice publication to talk about the market outlooks. And so this is the 2021. You might be able to search on here and find a more recent, even more recent projection. But they usually have a table in here that has a 10-year projection for ag markets, and so that's a nice summary to have. Again, take that with a grain of salt, but that's a good one. It's a data based projection. And then here's Harlan Hughes, writes a column for Beef Magazine where he projects prices regularly. That's a good one. And then this is the market commentary. If this one will come up. There we go. So here's a cattle market commentary, the cattle report, and this is a great one to read. It comes out every day. It's a great one to read every day to stay current with the industry. But usually down here they will have, so they'll have some cutouts, and then this is the part that I really like from this report. This shows you a current break-even projection. And so basically what that's saying is if you put a 750-pound steer on feed today, this is kind of what you could project. Okay, and so it tells you, it gives you a cost of gain estimate of $1.25 a pound for that, putting that steer today. It gives you interest cost. It tells you the estimates the break even for that animal at about 175. Wow. And the current futures price is 166. We'll talk about that in a minute, or in a class or two. That's the live cattle futures contract from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. But that's about 166. And so your profit is what this is estimating, is telling you that if you put this steer on feed today and these estimates happened, you would lose $110 on feeding that steer. Okay, and so that's if you put one on feed today. This table down here below is the current closeout. This is cattle that were put on feed 150 days ago, and you're selling them today. Okay, and so that's pretty cool. So you can see a 750-pound steer, if you bought him at Oklahoma City 150 days ago, would have cost 170, right? So you can look at the difference. Today he's 207. 105 months ago he was 170. So that shows you a little bit about the market. Estimates the cost of gain for what feeding this steer over the last 150 days was. Gives you interest cost. Tells you what your break even is. Your break even was 165 on this animal, and your current price as of today is 171. It's actually a little bit more than that, but from the other report that we saw, but the number that they use in this closeout is 171. And so if you slaughter a steer today, you would estimate you would have a profit of $91 per head. Okay, so this is a pretty useful website to kind of keep up with. Okay, so we'll hit a few more things here. Which budget figures are reasonable, and what's the biggest factor in a cattle budget? We've already talked about that. It's the cattle purchase that you have going in, and then what's a reasonable expectation of profit. So I usually will ask the class to think about that and estimate what they think is reasonable in terms of making a profit. So you could look at that. To look at that, you could look at some of these benchmarking programs. This is standardized performance analysis, and this kind of is mostly focused around cow-calf performance in the Southern Plains. And then this CHAPS program is a benchmarking program around cow-calf performance in the Northern Plains. This one comes out of North Dakota State. And so those are useful, but these are focused on cow-calf systems, and as far as I'm aware, there's not a good benchmarking program like that for stocker and feedlot cattle. But if you're looking for something for cow calf, those are good ones. Something that I do think kind of applies. We'll talk about this here. Show you kind of how this applies. But this is a chart from LMIC that shows cow calf returns over the last maybe 20 or something years, 30 years. And so what you can see here are that there's years that you have positive returns to cow per cow returns and negative per cow returns, and it kind of cycles a little bit. But the last 20 years have generally been pretty profitable for cow calf production, more profitable than not on average. But less than $100 per cow is a reasonable figure for a profit estimation. Okay, in 2014 and 15, we kind of had these really big outlier years where cows were super profitable, but we saw that, and basically it came right back to the trend that less than $100 per cow per year profit is reasonable in the cow calf industry. Expecting to make $300 or $400 a head profit in the cow calf industry is not a reasonable expectation over the long term. Okay, so we can look at the same thing for finishing cattle, and so this is about 20 years worth of data for quarterly returns on feeding cattle. Okay, in Kansas. And so what you notice here is it kind of cycles a little bit. There's times that there's negative returns and positive returns, but what you notice is there's a lot more red on this table than on the previous table, right? And so it's more often than not returns to feeding cattle tend to be negative, at least the way that it's calculated in this chart. Okay, and every feed yard's cost structure is different, so probably not every feed yard experiences this, but it's something to certainly be aware of, that this is kind of what it looks like over time. The average net return, the way they calculated in this data set, was negative $33 per head. So less than $100 a head is a reasonable figure for a profit expectation for feedlot cattle. The maximum net return in this chart was $388 per head back in 2017. And so it is, that would be the maximum. So, having a budget where you expect to make $300 a head, you think I'm gonna make $300 a head profit, that would be very unusual, and it would not be a good expectation. That to say I expect to consistently over the long term get $300 a head profit. That's not going to happen. $50 a head profit is a good goal over the long term. Okay, so just wanted to kind of show you what that looks like for feedlot cattle. It's hard to find. Here's another one, similar kind of data for feedlot cattle, returns to cattle feeders. And you can kind of see the same trend, a little bit different numbers, but the same trend over time. It's hard to find that information for stockers, but I did find a publication showing 3 different kind of stockering systems, basically buying different weights of cattle over time, and that's not super important for what I wanted to say today, but over about 10 years, you can kind of see the net returns to these different systems. And what you see is, again, in that $50 a head range is kind of what's reasonable, right? It's not reasonable to expect to make $300 a head profit per stocker in the long run. $50, maybe $100 a head would be a really good goal for making a profit on stockers. So having those numbers in your mind and your hip pocket, I think, is important, so that you can know when you're seeing an opportunity if an opportunity arises and it looks like you can make $50 a head, that's probably a reasonable profit, and you should probably try to do that, because it may not get a lot better than that. You shouldn't expect it to be a whole lot better than that over the long run. And also, if you have a goal in mind for how much money you want to make and live off of, knowing these kind of numbers gives you an idea of approximately the scale of operation that you're looking at. If you want to make $50,000 a year to live off of, and you're making $50 a head profit on average, which I think would be good if you can do that with stocker cattle. You do the quick math, you're going to need to run 1,000 stocker cattle a year to do that, right? So that's kind of the scale that you're looking at to try to achieve those goals. So I think that's important to understand as you're thinking about these businesses. Okay. This is a really important paper. I want you to read this paper. It's called The Factors That Drive Cattle Feeding Profitability, and I think it's a really nice summary of some of the things that go on in making those management decisions that help you understand what is affecting cattle feeding profitability. Okay. So problems for you to work on and think about. Again, we won't turn these in or anything, but just something for you to practice. Try to create a budget for stocker cattle that are grazed, that would be on an intensive early stocking program. We talked about what IES is. Just create a budget for stocker cattle this year on an IES program and get practice building that budget. If you do that, think about what's your projected profit and what's your break-even price for those cattle. And then, like what I just mentioned, think about how many of these cattle is it going to take? How big of an operation on IES would you need to run to achieve your desired income that you have for the year, for the summer, for doing that program. So that's a way you can practice kind of understanding how to use some of this information. So that's what I had for you on kind of the introduction to budgets, and appreciate your time, and we'll continue on with this discussion in class. Thanks.